Good morning. Packed house. That's good on a gorgeous day. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted to welcome you to the first of a couple of events today that really honor us. Special greetings to a number of board members. I don't see them all here, but I certainly see our former chairman of the board, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, in the front row. I'm also looking for others. Earl Stafford, Natalie Reyes, I saw her this morning. She's got to be there, yes. Oh, and Earl's over there. Fred Hochberg, don't see Fred. And Thelma Duggan. Thelma here? All right. Anyway, it is our honor today to host His Majesty the King of Spain, the fifth head of state to speak at the Wilson Center so far this year. This is his first official visit to the United States. He was at the White House yesterday, as all of you know, meeting with President Obama, and he'll join us soon to share his perspective on the security issues affecting his country and ours and most of the world. But first, we have an expert panel here to frame the conversation. They're the best scene setters you could ask for, and I'm happy to see so many good friends and former Wilson Fellows on the stage. You can come to Wilson anytime you want, but you can never leave. Fernando Renares is the director of the program on global terrorism at Elcano Royal Institute, and this event would not have been possible without him. He was a scholar here, studying ETA and the Madrid bombings, and we're so glad to welcome you back. Bruce Hoffman is the director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University, a dear friend who worked on his latest book, Anonymous Soldiers, as a Wilson Center Distinguished Scholar. We're also joined by Charles Powell, director of the Elcano Royal Institute, our partner in this event, and Bruce Rydell, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution who worked as a senior advisor on Middle East issues to the last 4 presidents. Our moderator is a powerhouse, a very tiny powerhouse, Catherine Herridge, a good friend of ours and chief intelligence correspondent for Fox News. It's an impressive group, and today they will discuss efforts to counter extremism around the globe. To get that conversation started, I'd like to invite Emilio Lamo de Espinosa, chairman of Elcano, to say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Thank you very much, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and to have the opportunity to engage in the transatlantic dialogue with all of you. Washington is, as is well known, the world capital of many things, among others, the world capital of think tanks. Wilson Center is a leading one, if not the leading one, and it's a great honor for the Elcano Royal Institute to be partnering with you in hosting this event. I hope the first of more to come, probably the next in Madrid. We have already discussed some of the possibilities. And allow me to start with just a minute of commercials, a short presentation of the Elcano Royal Institute. Obviously, we are an international relations think tank, small, at least by Washington standards, quite young too. Elcano was set up in 2001, largely as a consequence of the opening up not just of Spain's economy, but of Spanish society as a whole to the outside world. During the past decade, we have paid special attention to Europe, Latin America, the Maghreb, transatlantic relations, and we have developed particularly strong programs in defense and security, affairs, global terrorism, energy, and international political economy. We have always been, the Elcano, and personally I have always been, strong defenders of the Atlantic Alliance in a complicated country and through difficult times. After all, Spain was the first European country to become Atlantic, and one has just to mention the Latin American community, including the Latino community in the U.S., to support this statement. Although we are relative newcomers to the think tank community, I'm happy to say that we are gradually making a name for ourselves. Last year, for example, the University of Pennsylvania's think tank and civil society program placed 2 of our papers. By the way, both of them prepared in collaboration with other European think tanks, among them Chatham House, placed 2 of our papers among the best 3 published worldwide last year. Finally, as is obvious, we are a Royal Institute, His Majesty King Felipe, very much interested in international relations. You probably know that he has an MA degree from Georgetown in international relations. He has been our honorary president since the beginning, since 2001. We are particularly proud of this fact, and we are very, very grateful to His Majesty for having found the time to join us later this morning. Finally, and in case you are wondering about our name, Elcano, let me explain that to you. Juan Sebastián Elcano was a Basque sailor, not a musician, as it may seem, was a Basque sailor who accompanied Ferdinand Magellan in his last trip. As you may recall, together they discovered what we now call the Strait of Magellan, 1520, crossed the Pacific for the first recorded time, and when Magellan was killed in an ambush in southern Philippines, Elcano took over as commander of the fleet, returning finally to Spain in 1522 after many, many hardships. It was the first physical globalization of the world, the first recorded circumnavigation of the world. Today, 5 centuries later, globalization is, as we know, an everyday reality that we experience in our smartphones, in our cars, in world trade, investment flows, or, as we will see later, for example, in terrorism or in migration and refugee flows. And let me now turn to the issue that brings us here today, which is a transatlantic dialogue. Augusto Comte, the founding father of sociology, believed that demography is destiny. So let me start with some basic demographic figures that foresee somehow our destiny. When my father was born at the beginning of last century, Europe accounted for 25% of the world population, 1 out of 4. When I was born in the middle of that century, Europe was still 20% of the world population. Today, it is only 7%. There is currently only one European country among the 20 most populated countries in the world, which is namely Germany. Meanwhile, Asia accounts for 60% of the world's inhabitants, and Africa will soon have a population of 1,000 million people, as much as Europe and both Americas, North and South, combined, as much as the whole of the Western world. Moreover, the diffusion of technology, both hard and soft, is fueling the economic growth of these rising huge demographic powers. In April 2014, the Financial Times announced in its cover page that China was already the world's largest economy measured in purchasing power parity. India has overtaken Japan. Brazil's economy is now larger than that of France or the United Kingdom. As usual, these new economic powers are rapidly becoming major political players. Just last July, for example, provided plenty of fresh evidence of what I'm mentioning. Another BRICS summit, a summit of the Eurasian Economic Union, a summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the formal constitution of both the BRICS New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Finally, sooner or later, political powers unavoidably become also military powers. And although the United States continues to spend far more on defense than any other nation on earth, the gap, as we know, is narrowing. And of course, the willingness to project force is as important as the ability to do so. In short, it's quite obvious that the new world order is taking shape. The bipolar world of the past is long ago. The unipolar moment has come and gone, and we seem to be transitioning towards a brave new world, kind of a neo-Westphalian international society. A world full of opportunities, but also of risks and uncertainties. A world, certainly, where the Atlantic Alliance suffers from strains, but at the same time is more important than ever. Some think that Europe is a question of the past. Some think that the US may be more a liability than an asset. Europassing and anti-Americanism may have faded with Obama's administration, but they linger here and there. The latest US national strategy describes Europe as an indispensable partner. The European Union officially classifies the United States as a key strategic partner. Frankly speaking, I would like to see much stronger language on both sides. In my view, this is really the only relationship that is truly indispensable and strategic for both of us. Of course, we continue to rely on each other on a very vast array of issues ranging from conventional defense, counter-terrorism, climate change, energy security, and so on. In many ways, many ways, NATO remains, of course, the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship, and maybe see, at least, as the bedrock of international security overall. Certainly, we need a much more stronger European Union. More union in Europe and more Europe in the Union, as Jean-Claude Juncker said recently. Let me add immediately that at Elcano, Institute, we are convinced that there is no alternative to a United States of Europe, even though we are fully aware of the difficulties this will entail. Significantly, and it's important to mention that, the Spanish government itself has included this goal, the United States of Europe, in the foreign policy strategy it adopted last year. Spain is now pushing, somehow leading this project for a more closer union. Let me turn now just briefly to the specific of this seminar, the security challenges we face, both of us now. And what I want to convey to this distinguished gathering of persons is that the southern border of Europe, I mean the Mediterranean, is today probably the most marked, deep, contrasted frontier of the world that separates two totally different social worlds, certainly to religions, to cultures, to histories, a cultural divide that overlaps also with the biggest socioeconomic step in the world. The GDP per capita in Spain and Italy is about $35,000. That of Morocco is about $5,000. Egypt is about $6,000. Algeria about $7,000. A difference in wealth of 1 to 7, exactly twice the gap between the United States and Mexico. Add demography once more. The African median age is 20. The median age of Europe is 42. Add to all of this, finally, the Islamic terrorist groups moving freely throughout the huge and desolate lands of the Sahara and the Sahel, from Mauritania to South Sudan, pressing north and south, destabilizing the MENA countries, and penetrating as well in the Mediterranean through the Libyan corridor, and pushing to the Atlantic towards Western Africa and the Gulf of Guinea. Let me give you just one data. Terrorist attacks in the Maghreb countries, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. 15 in 2011, 90 in 2012, 302 in 2013, 698 in 2014. Now we can understand the dramatic flow of refugees and immigrants, a human tide that we are witnessing this day, of huge proportion that is putting Schengen Treaty and even European democracies to the test. This is not a European frontier, it is a world frontier, kind of a West frontier. Though I must add immediately, I consider this more kind of a revenge of geography than a clash of civilizations, to make a couple of references all of you identify immediately. Spain needs US support to increase NATO interest in the south, translating the testimonial recognition of the Wales summit to concrete measures. When NATO's Secretary General came to visit Elcano a few months ago, before the summer, we tried to convince him of this important priority. Let me now finish. The US, the United States, may not be the hyperpuissance it was, as Hubert Védrine said a few years ago, but it is still an indispensable nation in Madeleine Albright's often quoted statement. However, huge countries try to get a place in history. It already happened at the end of the 19th century, when the United States, Germany, and Japan emerged as world powers. That process, making room in the world for those new powers, cost us 2 world wars. Let's hope we can do things better now. As President Obama acknowledged, no single country in the world, however powerful, is capable of dealing with these challenges on its own. And that's why we Europeans are trying to build an ever closer union, a union that should bridge the Atlantic and be linked to another union, a pluribus unum. There is no alternative, and I finish, to a strong and healthy transatlantic relationship for the 21st century. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you very much, all of you.
Amelia, thank you very much for your opening remarks and, in effect, setting the scene for our discussion this morning. Also, thank you to Jane Harman and the Wilson Center for hosting this dialogue, and for all of you being here today, as the partnership between the United States and Europe has never been more important. After 9/11, the view always was that events or terrorist attacks would happen in Europe, and then it would be 4 or 5 years before it would come to the United States, which gave us a kind of breathing room, if you will, and to learn from Europe's experience. But what we now understand is how events in Europe can have an impact here in weeks or days, or with social media, almost in real time. I want to thank the panel for being here this morning. Our goal is to have a robust dialogue on the challenges that face the partnership today. And on that point, I'm going to begin with Bruce Riedel on my immediate right. We're watching hundreds of thousands of migrants flood into Europe. What is the catalyst? What is this a reflection of?
I think this is a reflection of incredibly bad governance in the Arab world, in particular the Muslim world in general, for the last half century. Many of the worst governed countries in the world exist in this part of the world. Take, for example, Syria. The Syrian regime, the Assad regime, Hafez and now Bashar, modeled itself intentionally on Stalin's Russia. Now that's not a particularly good example of good governance to pick. Muammar Gaddafi, much in the same way. Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The system worked as a police state for 50 years or so, but it fell apart in 2011, and it continues to fall apart. And what we've seen take its place is failed states and sanctuaries for groups like the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Shams, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and a host of other like-minded groups. We face today more sanctuaries and safe havens for the global jihadist movement than we've ever faced before. The contrast between today and 2001 is in 2001 you had basically one large sanctuary in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Today that sanctuary is still there, but you've got a spread of other sanctuaries across the region. One last thing I would say about Afghanistan and Pakistan, despite enormous efforts by the United States, Spain, and our other NATO partners, that gamble remains very much up in the air, and we're already seeing the recurrence and revival of Al-Qaeda core back in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is no U.S. or Spanish or European solution to the problem of bad governance in the Arab world. The Arabs have to figure out how to govern themselves better. I'm afraid here I'm going to be even a little bit more pessimistic. I don't see that happening. In fact, I see it getting worse, because the regimes that survived in the Arab world through the Arab Spring survived largely because they were able to buy off their populations with high oil income. High oil income is gone. That era is over. And particularly for police states like Algeria, one of the quintessential police states of today's world, built and modeled by someone who was trained by the KGB, is now going to face very serious challenges. And if you're looking for the revenge of geography, to quote you, Emilio, the revenge of geography, if Algeria starts to fall apart and we have a chaotic instability there, will be even worse than what we've been seeing so far.
Fernando, I'd like to bring you in as you look at these safe havens, which Bruce has said have really doubled in the last decade. Which do you think are emerging as the greatest threat, particularly to Europe?
Well, when speaking about the terrorism threat in Europe, first thing that we have to stress is the fact that we are currently in the middle of an unprecedented huge jihadist mobilization. One every 4 or 5 foreign terrorist fighters traveling to Syria and Iraq comes from Europe. Is a European Muslim or a Muslim living in Europe. And that means that Europeans or European Muslims are well overrepresented among foreign terrorist fighters. It's actually 1,600 times
Really?
overrepresented.
Really? And what explains that, if I could just ask?
Yeah, you see, this is not a problem affecting all European Union member states uniformly. Some states are more affected than others by far. Curiously, the problem is not there where we have centuries-old Muslim communities, such as in Bulgaria or in Cyprus. The problem is not in countries such as Italy or Spain, where the vast majority of Muslims are first immigration generations. The problem is concentrated on those countries where the large majority of the Muslim population is made out of second and even third generations. Just telling us this fact, in addition to the evidence that we don't have a socioeconomic or educational profile of these individuals. They are very diverse as to their social characteristics. This is leading us to the root problem, which is we are not being successful in socially accommodating second generations descendants from Muslim families who migrated to Europe. And those second generations have important segments suffering from an identity crisis. And this identity crisis for vulnerable people under the influence of private actors such as sometimes the family or public actors such as, for instance, Salafist preachers. They end up by accepting the idea that identity as Muslims is not compatible with their identity as French or Germans or European Union citizens. And well, as we know, an important number of them, no less than 5,000, already left Europe towards Syria and Iraq. But the threat is not just about those individuals and the likelihood for them to return or not. The fact is that the threat might also come from individuals who are radicalized but never left Europe. And now I also think it is important not to make a new mistake when analyzing the phenomena. Like the mistakes that we made, I use we,
the royal we.
Certainly not at Elcano, certainly not Elcano, certainly not Bruce. But you know, after 9/11, it became widespread in the academic circles, among journalists, even in the intelligence communities, this idea that Al-Qaeda was virtually destroyed, the global jihad became an amorphous phenomenon, and the threat was coming basically in the West from independent individuals themselves. And then we had that was a mistake. Then we heard of a second mistake when the upheavals started in some Arab countries. We again read and heard that Al-Qaeda was, that was a blow, the major blow that Al-Qaeda might ever suffer, that marked the start of the end for global jihadism. And the truth is not that. The threat in Europe might come from, yes, independent individuals, self-radicalized, independent cells, but also from individuals who are operatives, working for plans which are connected to the leadership of major terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. We have time later, and I even have some data with respect to Spain I will be happy to share.
Okay, so the numbers are growing. Bruce, I wanted to bring you in. So it would seem the Islamic State has continued to flourish, and is this a reflection of their a successful strategy on their part, or a reflection of a failed strategy on our part?
Well, I think it goes down to what actually, not for the first time, I will agree with Bruce Rydell that sanctuaries and safe havens are the fundamental problem. Just as publicity was the oxygen that sustained terrorism in the 20th century, as Prime Minister Thatcher famously said, in the 21st century, I think undeniably, it's been the ability, because of a failure of our policy, for a variety of terrorist groups, not just ISIS, to establish sanctuary and safe haven. The effects, I think, are that some of these groups have become basically hybrid forces, where they're no longer just terrorist organizations or even insurgent movements, but they're really putative armies. I mean, certainly ISIS has conventional military powers that probably eclipse those of some of the region's standing militaries, but that's not at all isolated. I would argue Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has the same capabilities. So this is the problem, I think, where a depressing dynamic has taken root, where we may be killing them, but they're seizing more territory and they're holding it. We downsize our military. The army is set to decline by tens of thousands, yet they continue to attract at least 1,000 foreign fighters a month. And it's not just from Europe or North Africa or the Middle East. Australia is tied with France as providing the third highest number. Canada, even though it has a tenth of America's population, of the United States' population, has provided twice as many foreign fighters. So this really is a global phenomenon. I think it comes down to that they have a message that's very difficult to counter. It's a message that harkens back to Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth, that the catharsis, the satisfaction, the empowerment that violence brings to people, fused with a religious justification that in essence makes sex, slavery, and guns and blowing things up somehow an acceptable vocation. And that's very difficult to counter. I mean, I think if you want to counter the ISIS threat, or the threat even from Al-Qaeda, is that you've got to start taking back the territory that they've seized. That's the card that they constantly play. That's their stock and trade.
So how do you do that without putting boots on the ground?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. Someone's going to have to put boots on the ground sometime, somewhere. We were talking in the green room, as it were, about Mali. Now, there was an example. Once again, the same dynamic existed. We could not train the Malian security forces faster than terrorists were flowing into the jihadi ranks. And France intervened very successfully. And actually, the Sahel now is a success story, as Charles was mentioning. So at some point, you know, we say too much because of our unhappy experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq that, you know, the military isn't a solution to all terrorist problems, and not every problem needs a hammer. But the point is, in the case like ISIS, there are some problems that need a hammer, and until we push them off the territory, we will not diminish their attraction or allure.
Is that also your view, Charles?
It is, yes. Basically, if I can actually go back to the refugees issue,
yes, of course.
because of course all of these things are linked. I have the Washington Post, this morning's paper. President Obama, after his meeting with the King yesterday, the King of Spain, said that the US and its allies may have to deal with the source of the problem, which is the ongoing crisis in Syria. And that is certainly the case. My take on why this flood of refugees has invaded Europe now and not before is basically because the countries in the region which were absorbing these refugees have reached a limit. Turkey has taken saturation point. Yeah, Turkey has taken 2 million Syrian refugees, Lebanon 1.1 million, and Jordan about 600,000 million. These people were basically waiting. Nobody wants to leave their country, their homeland, if they can possibly avoid it. I think these people were waiting to see if the international community got serious about Assad. And these people have finally come to the conclusion that that's not going to happen, and therefore this massive exodus, very dramatic and very moving exodus, was the only alternative. As far as the Islamic State is concerned, I think first of all we have the dilemma of simultaneity. We have to deal with Syria and with Iraq at the same time. One will not wait for us to get our act together on the other. We have to challenge them in both places at the same time. And as Bruce was saying, this is extremely difficult. In Iraq, as you all know, we have these three communities, the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds. The Kurds are basically the only ones who are doing any serious fighting, and yet, ironically, we in the West are not really giving them the kind of assistance they need. Spain is involved. Spain is back in Iraq, by the way, after our rather ignominious departure a little over a decade ago, to train Iraqi troops. But, you know, Iraqi troops surrender faster than we can train them, to put it bluntly. And we, as Bruce was saying in a very good article he published in Politico the other day, we have to revisit the way we train these troops and the way we equip them. My main take on Iraq, I'm particularly annoyed about our attitude towards Turkey. You know, Turkey is a member of NATO. They are supposed to be a close ally. Spain has actually deployed some Patriot missiles to the southern Turkish border to protect Turkey supposedly from Syria. But in practice, we all know the Turks are much more interested in bombing the Kurds than they are in trying to defeat ISIS. So we really need to do something about Turkey as far as Iraq is concerned. And my main concern about Syria, quite simply, is the Russian build-up and Iran. As you probably know, there's a recent British plan to try and get negotiations underway. I understand the Spanish delegation discussed this with the President yesterday. The British plan envisages a 6-month transition period after which Assad would somehow agree to leave, or perhaps agree to take a sort of symbolic position within his regime, sort of stand down to some extent. Frankly, I don't see either Iran or Russia allowing that to happen. So I'm, I think, even more pessimistic than Bruce, if that's actually possible.
Well, we're going to turn to the optimistic side of the table then. Let's talk about this Russia's decision to further engage with its longtime ally, Syria. Is this a reflection of Russia's ambitions in the region to strengthen its position, or a reflection of the fact that the Assad regime is really teetering on the brink of collapse?
Mr. Putin is a KGB officer. He didn't have a particularly distinguished career in the KGB. He was actually put in a backwater in East Germany. But I think he fully absorbed the ambiance, if you like, of the KGB, which was thuggish, always looking for an opponent's weak spot, and a partiality for covert operations, not always very well thought through, but covert operations for the sake of covert operations. In the case of Syria, I think what Mr. Putin sees is that the Assad regime, I wouldn't say is on the edge of collapse, but the stream is moving against the Assad regime. It's not going to fall tomorrow, it's not going to fall a month from now, but its hold on power is steadily eroding. It shouldn't come as any surprise. The Assad regime is built on the support of a minority community, the Alawis, who are maybe 13 to 14% of the population. How it lasted so long is actually a more interesting story than why it sooner or later is going to go out of business. But it's in trouble, and I think he is trying to prop it up. I think the Iranians are trying to prop it up, and Hezbollah is trying to prop it up. In his case, it's a symbol of Russian power in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. He doesn't want to see that symbol lost. For the Iranians and Hezbollah, it's even more important. If Damascus and the rest of Syria falls into the hands of a Sunni government, Lebanon is next. And they've made no secret that that's their intention. And there's a consensus in the Syrian opposition, the Syrian moderates, the al-Nusra Front, the Islamic State. They all want to look to bring it on to the Iranians sooner or later. Problem for us, of course, is that while there's a consensus that ISIS is a problem in the region, I would characterize it as every part of the alliance against ISIS sees ISIS as the number 2 problem, not the number 1 problem. And Turkey is the classic example. Turkey recognizes that ISIS is a problem, but the Kurds are a bigger problem, so they're going to focus on that. Iran recognizes that ISIS is a big problem, but its more immediate objective is dealing with the Saudis in Yemen, in Lebanon, and other places. The only people who seem to see ISIS as the number 1 problem is the al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda, and that's not necessarily an alliance we can do a whole lot of work with.
So, on an even more pessimistic note, perhaps, Fernando, I wanted to bring you in because you said you had new numbers on Europeans going into Syria and Iraq. And given that this panel projects greater instability, let's say over the next 18 months or 2 years, do you see the numbers continuing to rise?
Yes, the numbers are rising. We have certainly several indicators. The number of arrests, for instance, is growing by year, particularly since 2011. This past year has been since 9/11, the year where more individuals have been arrested, for instance, in the UK, to give you an example. And we have, of course, the other indicator, which is foreign terrorist fighters.
May I ask, are they all under 35 by and large? What is the age span that we're looking at?
They tend to be men, about 85-90% of them, Now, the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra as well, but perhaps the Islamic State even more, is being able to attract more women, to recruit more women than Al-Qaeda was or Al-Qaeda related groups in the past. Probably because what Al-Qaeda is offering now to these people is not just membership into an underground organization, suffering from state persecution in Pakistan or hardship in the Sahel areas, but is offering to travel and join a new society, the new society with a territorial basis that they were able to establish in Syria.
So they are offering an identity and a
Iraq.
home for these people. Is that fair, or
They go to colonize, not to become fighters. And you see, just by looking at the data gathered with respect to Spain, the one I was mentioned before, we get an idea of how things are evolving. No? By the way, even though Spain is not one of the European countries more seriously affected by this jihadist radicalization and recruitment, as I say, unprecedented. It is interesting, though, that until 2012, since the middle 90s, only 11% of all those individuals convicted in Spain for jihadist terrorism offenses were Spanish nationals, and only 4% were born in Spain. As from 2013, when we started to see what the implications of the Syria and Iraq jihadist propaganda activities were, as from 2013, half of all those individuals arrested in Spain for jihadist terrorism offenses are Spanish nationals. And 8 out of every 10 come from the only 2 cities in Spain where we have a sizable Muslim community, and that community is largely composed by second generations. That is Ceuta and Melilla. It is also important that surrounded by Moroccan territory, and not just any Moroccan territory, but surrounded by the 200 years, an area which known in the past for harboring jihadist circles. But let me share with you, just for that, additionally, we have the same ratio in Spain than the U.S., for instance, of foreign terrorist fighters with respect to the total Muslim population living in the country. So in that sense, we are more similar to the US than to France or Belgium or Germany or Finland. No? And that is the good basis, that is a good basis for experience sharing and cooperation in the future, in addition to the ongoing very good cooperation on police, judicial, intelligence matters. You see, since 2013, Spain has arrested well over 100 individuals for jihadist terrorism offenses related to Syria and Iraq. And 87% of the cases were men. For the first time, we have a significant number of converts, which was unknown in the past. But perhaps the most interesting fact is that now that so many talking is out there in the media about lone wolves and self-radicalized people, only 1 out of every 10 of those individuals was self-radicalized. So they 90% underwent this radicalization and recruitment process in group. And actually, inside networks, which in half of the cases are new networks created precisely in the context of the Syria and Iraq conflicts. But in the other half of the cases are networks which are regenerated networks. That is, that individuals who in the past were, in Guantanamo, or were convicted, or were arrested but not convicted, now found a new opportunity to reestablish those networks. And important thing, 100% of those networks in Spain had the Islamic State as organization of reference. In 1/4 of the cases, that was shared with Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, in 85% of the cases, the individuals belonged to networks having organizational links to the Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra, not just ideological inspiration, but organizational links. With this more problematic, even for a country like Spain, which is, I insist, not among those more affected.
Affected, right.
You just have to see what the figures are in France or in Belgium or in Germany, even the UK these days. 60% of those individuals were embedded in networks having operational capabilities.
Operational capabilities for
operational
attacks
capabilities
within
to
that
attack.
country? Okay.
Actually, in almost 40% of the cases, the individuals were members of networks having terrorist training as part of their functions.
I want to pick up on that point because this aspect of the small cell and recruitment is particularly acute in the UK. And we have now seen British citizens taking on important leadership roles within ISIS in Syria, and this has led to a real shift in the strategy in terms of targeting.
Yes, of course, E. Hardy John became sadly famous as a particularly nasty character. And Britain, I think, has done something unprecedented. As you know, over the summer, Prime Minister Cameron announced that 2 British jihadists had been taken out in Syria. And this is the first time that this has happened, that the Royal Air Force has used armed drones against British citizens in Syria outside a conventional war scenario. The legal grounds for this are questionable, and there is already a very significant debate in Britain about this. And the recently elected leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, has already spoken very strongly against this kind of action. Very interestingly, the French are planning apparently to do something similar. Manuel Valls, the French Prime Minister, spoke in the National Assembly last week, and he explained that there are, I think it's about a dozen French fighter planes surveying the Syrian scenario to see if they can detect French jihadists or people who are planning to carry out terrorist attacks in France. So this is very significant. I think the US probably didn't quite expect this to develop as in the way in which it has. The French, of course, are responding to the horrible attacks in January, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I believe as many as 8 attacks have been aborted since then. So France is in a state of very high alert, and as I said, the French government is taking these unprecedented measures. I'm slightly alarmed by these developments, to be honest, because the French are actually sort of doing it their own way. They aren't consulting terribly closely with their EU allies and partners, and this obviously is going to generate considerable controversy in the rest of Europe. But it does express, I think, how seriously the issue is being taken by our public opinions.
Well, in the United States, when the American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki became the first American targeted for death by the CIA in 2011, this remains controversial because this is such a departure from the U.S. legal system, because we set up a strategy, if you will, where the executive branch of the U.S. government became judge, jury, and executioner, and this is a very un-American principle, and there is certainly a solid argument that this is a win for the terrorists because we've made such a departure from the principles that we have held. I wonder, Bruce, if you can sort of pick up on this point and how other nations are now facing the same debate because of the severity of this threat?
Well, I'm not a jurist, so I'm going to dodge the legal implications and say that it's the kind of it's the kind of operation that I think is a feel-good operation in many respects. It's that do something, do anything, and you're striking a blow against the terrorists. But I think this is again one of the weaknesses of our policy in recent years, is that we've confused a tactic with a strategy, and it's an effective tactic. I have nothing against killing terrorists per se. I agree with you completely that Anwar al-Awlaki's death raises very serious issues given our Constitution. But the point is, I mean, look at South Asia, and Bruce Riedel referred to al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and the core al-Qaeda operation that still exists there. I mean, for years we've been saying that there are only 50 al-Qaeda in South Asia. I mean, since 2010 we've killed probably a magnitude of tenfold that number. So it's fine, you know, to kill terrorists, but it has to be part of a larger strategy, because I would argue that the threat from al-Qaeda is also rising. Twice in the past week we've had statements from Ayman al-Zawahiri. So this may be the terrorist group that we want to forget, but they haven't gone away. And you can see, as a strategist, al-Qaeda hanging back and letting ISIS, as it were, take all the heat and also cause divisiveness amongst the Western alliance. In some cases, frustration and enervation with once again having perhaps to intervene in the Middle East, while al-Qaeda waits in the background and then emerges all the stronger. And what was striking about Zawahiri's message, which I think few people appreciated, is he was holding out the potentiality of a merger or of some reamalgamation.
I'd be interested to hear everyone's thoughts on that, because it was very peculiar language on its face.
No, I don't think so, because for two reasons. One, al-Qaeda and ISIS's ideology is identical. There is absolutely no difference. The only difference is in the timing of when you could declare the caliphate. And of course, al-Qaeda has a strategy that they defined in 2005, 7-stage strategy, and the 5th stage was the declaration of the caliphate that they envisioned between 2013 and 2016. So ISIS stole their lunch, in essence. But what's interesting is, since the split a year and a half ago, ISIS propaganda, with the exception of sort of the calumny directed against Zawahiri, there's a personal rivalry and a profound enmity between Baghdadi, the ISIS head, and Zawahiri. With the exception of that, ISIS's propaganda has been praising bin Laden, claiming that they're the true inheritors or exemplars of bin Laden, praising other al-Qaeda sheikhs, and even talking about reunification. So now when you have Zawahiri similarly exchanging messages of that sort and similarly talking about the same thing, the war against terrorism, unfortunately, in al-Qaeda's trajectory has clearly not played out. There still may be a yet even more depressing phase than the depressing ones we've revealed at this table of cooperation between ISIS and al-Qaeda, which would be extremely worrisome. And why is al-Qaeda focusing on South Asia? India, of course, has the 2nd largest Muslim population in the world, so they see South Asia as
a growth
fertile
market
ground.
there, in effect.
I agree with basically with what Bruce just said. It is evident that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have disagreements, not just on the legitimacy of the caliphate, but on the legitimacy of certain forms of violence.
No, that's true.
Because Zawahiri criticized
Yes.
ISIS for the execution of the American Peter Kassig, who was a convert, and it seemed to be on the basis of his conversion
Yes.
that they were chastised for murdering him.
And it's not the only act of brutality that the Al-Qaeda has criticized. However, yes, they are now rivalizing for hegemony within the global jihadist movement, but the current competition might turn into cooperation, and we have some signs that may be possible. We have a lot of jihadist ambivalence, for instance, all through Northern Africa, groups that are not
Sort of not
sided
self-declared,
and are
right.
awaiting, and even the individuals who are working jointly but belong to different sides within the global jihadist movement now. And then we have to remember Paris. We have to remember Paris. There we have 4 terrorists. 2 of them sided with the Islamic State, and the other 2 sided with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And yet, they coordinated the operations.
Right.
And so a lot of jihadists in Europe are not taking for granted this division, and probably external pressures might at some point debilitate this personal animosity between al-Baghdadi and al-Zawahiri, and make it possible what will be the worst scenario for us, a merger and the unity of jihadists having now sizable portions of the territory, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in other parts of Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on.
But does it take place sort of in this, they strike a relationship because of the opportunity as opposed to committing long-term to each other, Bruce?
This argument within the jihadist movement is actually quite old. Baghdadi's predecessor, Abu Musab Zarqawi, had the same argument with Ayman Zawahiri. We're just seeing it played out over again. Part of it's a personality problem. You know, bear in mind, these are ruthless, sadistic murderers who encourage people to go out and commit suicidal terrorism. These are not, your normal next-door suburban neighbor. Their egos are, to say, a bit prickly. But they're also people who are very much of the same mind. Their argument really is over who is the legitimate heir of Osama bin Laden. That's the big argument. We saw that play out last month. How does Zawahiri respond to Baghdadi's arguments that I'm in charge? He produces Hamza bin Laden, the favorite son of Osama bin Laden, who says Zawahiri is the right guy. But they also have an interest in cooperation. I think Fernando's point about Paris is very, very important. The further you get away from the heartland of the dispute, and you're in the operational battlefield, these questions of should the caliphate been declared in Mosul in 2014, or should we wait a while, or is Mullah Omar commander of the faithful, or Caliph Ibrahim, they kind of fade when you're in the business of actually carrying out terrorism. And that's a problem that I think I don't foresee a formal merger of these groups, but I foresee a lot of tactical cooperation. We've seen it in other places before. Al-Qaeda in Iran, for example. The Iranians are not in bed with Al-Qaeda, but we've seen cases in which where the Iranians have allowed Al-Qaeda to do things on its territory, which it figured was good for it because it struck at the Great Satan, and the Great Satan was unlikely to be able to prove a convincing case of Iranian involvement. That's just a demonstration that Al-Qaeda, from its very beginning, has always been willing to make tactical adjustments in order to improve its operational capability. I want to say a word about the response, because I think your question about drones brought it up very clearly. So far, 3 countries have used drones with lethal intent. Israel was the first, the United States was the second, now the Royal Air Force has joined. The 4th candidate is already out there, it's Pakistan. Pakistan has developed drones, and it intends to use them with lethal intent. And many more are following. It's a reflection of the fact that in the war against global jihad, the hard power aspects of the war have done very, very well. I think Charles earlier said, or maybe Bruce, that every problem does not require a hammer, but every problem does require a carpenter, someone to come up with a strategy that includes using a hammer and includes a lot of other things. I think when President Obama came into office in 2009, he had a pretty good understanding of this. He had to have hard power and he had to have soft power. Unfortunately, the reality 6 years later is the hard power is on steroids. We're very good at it, and we've become somewhat addicted to it. The soft power parts of it, which are actually really hard to do, things like addressing governance in the Arab world, things like addressing underlying disputes like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Kashmir conflict, those things are really hard to do, and all of them have kind of stultified over the last 6 years. We need to get this balance back together again. The last point I would make on that front is, there's a very good example of an Arab state which is not terribly mismanaged, which is actually managed, I won't say beautifully, but it's managed better than most, and that's Spain's immediate neighbor, Morocco. And the more that the United States and the European Union and Spain has taken the lead on this more than anyone else can do to try to help develop good governance in Morocco by things like encouraging economic relations and trade relations and encouraging resolution of disputes that Morocco is involved in. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do. We need to, I don't want to give up drones. We don't have another method of killing Anwar al-Awlaki or people like that today. But we need to be doing something to address, for example, the horrendous state of the situation in Yemen today. In Yemen today, 21 million people are at risk of either starvation or worse, dehydration. And the international community seems to be doing virtually nothing about it. We're actually providing a lot of assistance to the Saudis in their use of hard power. We're not doing very much on the soft power side. They're a graphic example, an immediate example.
Before we open it up to audience questions, I wanted to talk about Mali and why that was a successful strategy, balancing this hard power with the soft power.
Well, let me just say something about that region. Sahel in Arabic means coastline. And for many centuries, the Sahel was a wonderful barrier between North Africa and the rest of the continent. And my chairman will remember, because it struck us so vividly, a foreign minister from one of the Sahel countries came to Elcano a few months ago, and he basically said, you know, this evaporated overnight because of three very simple innovations: the GPS, the Toyota Land Cruiser, and a satellite telephone. And what you now have is a swathe of territory from Mauritania to Sudan, which is a 6-lane highway, which is ideal for drug trafficking, people trafficking, and arms trafficking. So that was a very daunting prospect to have to face. Basically, I think Mali worked for several reasons. First of all, because the French were very proactive, and of course they were criticized for that by some, but they provided the boots on the ground. Secondly, I think because the EU used its combination of hard and soft power quite effectively. We had an EU military mission, and Spain took part in that, training the Mali military, but we also had an EU civilian mission dedicated precisely to the kind of state building and governance issues that Bruce was talking about. So that showed that, you know, we Europeans aren't always a bunch of postmodern wimps. And you know, toothless postmodern wimps, I think, is exactly the expression I was looking for. And, you know, and we do have a rather sophisticated toolbox, and I think Mali, therefore, is a success story that we need to remember.
So what was the catalyst to getting this plan into play?
Well, ironically, the catalyst, I think, was very strong post-colonial relationships between the metropolis and the former colony. And of course, those don't always work, and sometimes the love-hate relationship is more of a hate-hate relationship. But in this case, it worked beautifully.
Bruce, is there anything you want to add before we go to questions?
Well, I would say the exemplar of Mali, I think, is a pattern that we've seen, is that no indigenous peoples that have been subjugated to Al-Qaeda or ISIS's yoke have ever thrown off that rule without some form of foreign intervention. And I suspect that's likely going to remain the pattern.
Okay, we're going to open up to questions. Jane, if you'd like to begin.
Superb panel, superbly moderated, no wimps. So I wanted to go back to something Bruce said about the recruitment, or many of you said, and how effective it is. And you said one of the reasons they're effective is because they hold territory, and that there is a complete implosion of governance, if there ever was any governance in the Arab world. But isn't it also true that their messages are effective, what they actually tweet and these push tweets that they do? And what I don't think any of you addressed whether we have a counter message, aside from taking back territory, that could persuade kids, impressionable kids, including women, girls in the United States and Europe, not to do this.
Well, firstly, the importance of having the territory is that if you do have the message, you have then the destination for the recruits to come to. In terms of the messaging, ISIS has been enormously effective because I think contrary to the image that these are just people out in the desert just tweeting and communicating promiscuously with others elsewhere, they're very highly choreographed, they're very tightly controlled. The U.S. attorney in Minnesota In April, it said we see the customization now of recruitment, that individuals are targeting their friends, members of their community. In terms of the response, actually, I despair. I think it's a dry well, in the sense that how do you counter a message? And it is Frantz Fanon's message of the catharsis, the satisfaction, the empowerment of violence, and plus rolled into that is sex, having slaves. It's very different to push back against it. And I think the way to push back against it is to diminish the power, diminish the allure of ISIS and other groups, which means taking down their states, destroying what they're claiming is this utopia. That's what's attracting people.
Please.
I would just add to that, I mean, this is a deeper sort of philosophical debate. A lot of these youngsters claim that they live empty, meaningless lives, and that this is the promise of some kind of fulfillment. How do you combat that? That requires a much broader kind of strategy, and not just to deal with this phenomenon, but other phenomena that are so prevalent among our youth. But that's a different story.
I agree with all of that. I absolutely agree. We have to remove the allure of this state that's out there. But I think there's another part of the problem, which goes into messaging. What is the message of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State? And that is that the Islamic world is under attack by a Zionist crusader conspiracy. What is our argument to that? Well, if you turn on television every night, the lead story is we're now bombing, another country has joined the war to bomb some part of the Muslim world. Now, we have a legitimate argument for why we're doing that, but it's pretty hard to compete when every night the television sets are reinforcing the message that Islam is under attack. What's another part of the message, which is that the Zionist Crusader Alliance is in bed with the regimes that misgovern the region, which treat its citizens terribly, and which are puppets in their hands. Well, who's in the White House from the Middle East a few days ago? The King of Saudi Arabia, kind of the symbol of the misgovernance for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I'm not saying we shouldn't have the King of Saudi Arabia in there, but I don't think we're messaging very well. Another important message, highlighted in the message I spoke about earlier from Hamza bin Laden. It's all about Israel, Palestine, and Jerusalem. He spent more time in his first message talking about Jerusalem than he did about any other specific issue. Well, we have a counter-argument on that, and that is that we are in favor of a two-state solution and negotiations to bring it about. We are? What are we doing about a two-state solution and negotiations to bring it about? Nothing. We put that into it's too hard to do. Let Hillary or whomever deal with it in 2017. We're just going to glide on that. My point is this. I agree. We've got to fight the terrorists. We've got to take away the allure, the symbolism that they have. But we've also got to have a message which shows we're not the Zionist Crusader Alliance trying to rape and impoverish the Islamic world. And right now, I don't see that we have a very good case to make on that front.
And is there some merit, I wanted to put this to you, Fernando, is there some merit to taking these people who have been able to escape their enslavement in Syria and using them almost as, for lack of a better term, sort of a poster child for what life is really like in the Islamic State? If you can't take away the territory, maybe you can expose it for what life in Syria is really about, the sexual abuse and the gang rape and the no plumbing and all of the rest of it that goes with it.
All that can seriously help, yes, because what makes the Islamic State, in addition to what the other panelists say, what makes the Islamic State message extremely powerful is success. They are seen by vulnerable young Muslims as a successful organization. Al-Qaeda has the goal of establishing a caliphate. The Islamic State made it real. the videos that the Islamic State is producing on a daily basis are not just about doctrinal matters or topical conflicts or fighting and military events. They're about agricultural policy and everyday life in a market town. And so, as I said before, they are calling not to join an underground terrorist organization. The call they make is to relocate to become part of the new society being built because they hold this territory where they can do so.
Another,
The
oh, go
nation
ahead,
building
please.
and state building, which is, I think, an entirely different game. This is why I would argue that Syria is so important. I mean, as far as Syria is concerned, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If we allow Assad to remain in power, a lot of Syrians will continue to be attracted to the Islamic State because it is seen as the only force that can overthrow Assad, and that coincides with what Bruce was saying. At the same time, of course, if we try and overthrow Assad, we will create a vacuum, and there's nothing that Jihadi likes more than a vacuum. So we really are in a deep quandary there.
Okay, another question from the audience. Yes, right in the second row, please.
I'm Amal Mudallali with the Wilson Center. My question is about the Russian involvement. How are you? The Russian involvement in Syria. The American rationale for not intervening in Syria was that they are afraid of a slippery slope.
Yes.
Is there a fear of should Putin be afraid of a slippery slope in Syria? And are we going to see another Afghanistan there? Thank you.
It's a very good question. The quagmire of Syria could easily and happily absorb one more fox into the quagmire. I think what I suspect, though, is that Putin's objective is more limited. He has no intention of solving the Syrian problem. He's not going to resolve the dispute. I think what he has in mind is propping up a miniature Alawite state in Latakia and Tartus connected to the Hezbollah state in Lebanon. In that sense, while it could still be a quagmire and could be expensive, he's not trying to take on the whole thing. The challenge the United States has always been faced with is go in and fix the whole problem, which in practical terms means if you're going to put boots on the ground, an awful lot of boots on the ground in an awful lot of places, and you're probably going to antagonize an awful lot of people. Putin's objectives, I think, are much more limited than that. And in that sense, I think he can also tolerate the pain pretty well. And I don't see, by the way, I don't see any change in American policy here. President Obama is often criticized for having no Syria strategy. I don't think that's true at all. I think President Obama has a Syria strategy, and that is to stay out at all costs. And I think it's based upon his analysis of the situation, which is that this is a quagmire, that there is no good solution to, and that therefore the thing that the United States wants to do is keep out becoming in charge of putting together the broken Humpty Dumpty of the Syrian state. And he draws as his analogies Iraq, Afghanistan, and even more importantly, I think, for this president, Libya. Because in the case of Libya, he was persuaded by some of his advisors to take on Humpty Dumpty. And then they discovered, my gosh, this is really a broken state. This is a figment of Italian fascist colonial policy. And he repelled from it and pulled away from it. And I think Syria from him from the beginning has been the same thing. So I don't see significant changes in American policy towards either Syria or these other states until we have a new administration, and that may not change it either, but certainly not going to happen on the Obama.
You know, we have not talked about Libya. I just want to get in a couple of questions on that because ISIS has now established, I would say, a fairly significant presence in Libya. Bruce, is it your view that there is close coordination between ISIS in Libya and ISIS in Syria, or is it more autonomous, setting its own agenda for North Africa?
Well, ISIS has proven to be enormously opportunistic, and given the number of Libyans that converged on Syria and Iraq, that they saw that they have this nascent capability that could be developed. And they view these things not as we discussed in the context of Al-Qaeda as affiliates, but rather as provinces, actually.
Okay.
And Libya is one of the more significant ones. It's probably where ISIS has a more significant toehold. I'm not necessarily sure that, given the challenges that ISIS has in Syria and Iraq, that it's coordinating or exercises any kind of direct command and control. But it's emulating the Al-Qaeda model. There's at least a half dozen of these provinces or vilayets from North Africa to the
Right.
Caucasus to South Asia, and they're hoping to capitalize on them and again build, at least create this image of an unstoppable ideology that is spreading and acquiring not just new adherents that they can attract foreign fighters, but again, going back to our points almost this entire morning, seizing and controlling
Right,
territory and
right.
exercising some sovereignty, however crude it might be in Libya.
And Charles, does Libya present itself as really the springboard into Europe?
No. I liked what Bruce said about the paradox of humanitarian intervention and followed by the desire not to intervene, because we know that that's such a mistake. No, I think Libya is no longer really perceived in that light. I was struck by something Bruce said earlier about Morocco and Algeria, and I wanted to come to,
Yes,
back to that
please.
very briefly, because, and not just for selfish reasons, because Morocco and Algeria happen to be our closest trading partners in the region, but also because, you know, it runs against, I think they're two very different cases. Morocco is an authoritarian monarchy, if you like, but it's been undertaking significant political reforms. It's achieving relatively good levels of economic growth. It's a more inclusive society than it used to be, and the king seems to be dealing with the political Islam quite effectively. Algeria, I think, is an entirely different kettle of fish. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in Europe, and from Spain in particular, is we've been trying to get them to open up their border. People forget that the Moroccan-Algerian border, incredibly, is still closed. So how can we possibly talk about encouraging prosperity in the Maghreb region when the two biggest countries in the Maghreb don't even have an open border? So these are the kinds of challenges, you know, that we can, I think, contribute to overcome.
Another question from the audience, please. Yes?
Thank you all very much. What are the political implications and going forward the longevity of the Schengen Agreement, given that countries within the European Union have either respected or altered their agreement to the open border policy that has been agreed to in the United Nations or European Union policies? Thank you.
Schengen is not under serious threat. What the German and the Austrian governments have done in the last couple of days is fully in keeping with the Schengen protocols. It's a temporary suspension of free movement of peoples, which will be restored, I think, very shortly. President Tusk, the President of the European Council, will decide tomorrow whether he convenes an extraordinary extraordinary European Union Council meeting to deal with the refugee issue. And once he does that, I think you will see the Germans and the Austrians lifting restrictions on Schengen. I think what's actually much more surprising is not so much the fact that Schengen was temporarily suspended, but the amazing policy, the amazing attitude of the German authorities in the first few days of the crisis. I think Germany is going to absorb about a million refugees. A million refugees. And this is an extraordinary figure by any standard. The problem basically is not so much Germany or Austria, but I think the attitude of the Hungarians, the Slovaks and the Czechs. The recent arrivals into the European Union, understandably, they're still to some extent enjoying the benefits of sovereignty. They've only recently become democracies and fully fledged sovereign states. And they're out of sync with the rest of us in Europe. And this is becoming very obvious. You know, the European Union motto is united in diversity. Sadly, you could also say it's disunited in adversity. That's what we're seeing these weeks.
Yes, please. Second row.
I'm Timothy Towell. I spent a portion of my 31 years in the State Department on Spain in the 60s. I was very impressed with what Emilio said in his wonderful opening comment on the crucial relationship of the United States and Europe in facing the chaos of this wonderful world we were discussing. The corollary, of course, is the relationship between Spain and the United States. What's going to happen with the relation between Spain and the United States when the whole United States on TV tonight is going to listen to the man with the bad hairdo who hates Hispanics, who hates Latin Americans, who hates La Madre Patria, and calls them crooks, rapists, murderers? What's going to happen to our wonderful relationship between the United States and Spain that His Majesty underlined yesterday when he met with the President of the United States in the White House?
Thank you for the question. Welcome to Your Majesty. Thank you for joining the Wilson Center and the discussion this morning. You're just in time for almost a Donald Trump-related question. So to the panel, this is sort of one of the political questions given the dynamics here in the United States, Charles.
Well, I totally share your concern. Obviously, Donald Trump in the White House would not be good news for the Spanish-U.S. relationship, the relationship between the United States and the whole of the Latin American world. I think it's very interesting how North Americans perceive Spain and the Hispanic phenomenon, and it doesn't always coincide with the way we perceive it. We in Spain attach enormous importance to the fact that there are almost 50 million Spanish speakers in this country. Obviously, Spain sees that as a wonderful opportunity for strengthening economic relationships, cultural relationships, and so on. And obviously, under that kind of presidency, our plans in this area would suffer very significantly. So let's hope that this doesn't happen.
I tell my Canadian friends that if Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, they will probably have to build a wall to keep millions of Americans from trying to get out of this country and fleeing north. And that's probably also the secret of how he thinks Mexico will build it. It's to keep Americans from moving to sunnier climes. American politics are always entertaining. I think it's important for our European and other friends to bear in mind that we're still in the swimsuit part of the competition here. And the more serious part is yet to come. Whenever I mention that, though, to a lady, she almost always reminds me that it's the swimsuit part of the competition that seems to matter the most. So it's a very depressing thought.
Okay, the next question, please. Yes, please, in the back.
Thank you very much for all of the insight this morning. I was hoping that the panel might be able to comment on the increasing number of visits by Russian military hardware to the Spanish port city of Ceuta, something that seems to run contrary to Spain's interests in a negotiated settlement in Syria. Thank you.
I can answer that. That is actually an unsubstantiated claim. There has not been a significant increase of that nature.
Anyone else? Next question. Yes, please, in the back.
Fatima Sadiqi from Morocco, but also Wilson Center scholar. One of the common denominators between all the terrorist groups is their, between quotes, hatred of women. And also the spectacular use of gender-based violence, and you mentioned some of that. And my question is, in what you called, bad governance countries, the silver lining, I'm giving you an insider view, is that women's rights are flourishing in these countries, or they started to flourish. Now, don't you think that more interest to what is done by women or for women inside these countries may also be a helpful path to pursue, in addition to what you mentioned? Thank you.
I'll take a partial stab at that. When we talk about bad governance, you're absolutely right. Governance that excludes from the governing body half, or actually a slight majority of the population, is not good governance. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, have been very much in the mainstream of Wahhabi Salafist Islamic thinking, Taliban thinking about the misgovernment of women. It seems to me we have a pretty good story to tell. We actually support women's empowerment. And we actually have a concrete example of where the United States and its NATO partners did something about it, and that's Afghanistan. When we went into Afghanistan in 2001, roughly 100,000 Afghan children were going to some kind of school. It wasn't much of a school to start with, and 0 of those were Afghan women. Today, 2015, somewhere between 8 and 9 million Afghan children are going to school, and over 40% of them are women. We have, in the course of 1 decade, set in train a revolutionary progress in Afghanistan. What disturbs me is we don't seem to be proud of it. We don't seem to talk about it. You know, we seem to, you know, that's kind of like, oh yeah, well, that's true, but we want to stay focused on fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and things like that, and mostly we just want to get out. I think we have a record to be proud of there. We should build on it, and we should make it as part of why NATO intends to stay after 2017 and not simply dump Afghanistan back to where it found it 16 years ago. I think there are other places we could do this as well, and I think that the United States should be putting a lot more pressure on its partners in the Middle East who refuse to recognize that women have a right to play. And in particular, by that I mean the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
And on that point of having, considerable success in Afghanistan, if you're going to use the education of women as a marker, is there a point at which we, and I use that sort of in the broadest sense, can step back from the table and leave that to the Afghans? Or do we, in effect, commit to, if it's not a minimal presence, but a long-term presence in the region to keep that infrastructure in place?
I think given the fragility of many of the societies where we've attempted to train indigenous forces but also fundamentally alter the societal dynamics requires a staying power and a commitment, because time and time again I think that we've declared victory or declared success precipitously only to see a slide back to the same patterns as before.
I think it's going to depend on the security situation after our military withdrawal, which is, of course, happening very soon. I think if the security situation is stable, then the US and Europe will want to and will be able to invest in Afghan education, health, and other areas through civil society organizations and others. The crucial question mark, however, is how stable is this situation that we're going to leave behind.
But maybe it's an old-fashioned idea, but by leaving some presence behind, even if it's a minimal presence, does that not message to those on the ground that there is a long-term commitment to their success?
Only if they feel secure.
Yes, question over here, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon. I'd like to ask Fernando, how do you describe public support of Spanish on fight against terrorism in Spain? And how do you describe the cell groups operating in Spain, cell groups of terrorists?
Well, the description of the networks that currently operate in the country is basically what the one I made before. Cells and networks which in some cases are new and were formed as a relation or in the context of the Syria and Iraq conflict. In some other cases were regenerated. Cells and networks that have the Islamic State as their organization of reference, and cells and networks which are accumulating operational capabilities in addition to all the radicalization and recruitment tasks that they perform. Now, Spain, following the 2004 Madrid train bombings, underwent a major reform of internal security. And that was basically increasing intelligence capabilities with respect to international terrorism, coordinating better the agencies involved. For that particular matter, National Center for Counter-terrorism Coordination was established, and also strengthening international cooperation. Spain had, before the Madrid bombings, had a very good anti-terrorist system, a very efficient one, like the UK, but very good and very efficient when dealing with ETA or the IRA, or rather known expressions of the terrorist threat. So they had a lot to adapt to this new variety of terrorism. Now, each and every single measure introduced by the government since the Madrid bombings found great public support from the population. The population is now, contrary to what happened a decade ago, is fully aware that we face a threat, which is a changing threat, and that requires adapting our instruments, our agencies, our institutions to properly face this problem. And so the authorities over the past decade have been working with a lot of popular support in this particular matter.
Catherine, could I just add
Yes,
something very
please.
briefly? A lot of people don't know that Spain absorbed more immigrants per capita during the last decade, approximately 5 million, more than any country in the world except the United States. Many of these immigrants were Moroccans, and therefore of Muslim origin. And in spite of that, Spain has no xenophobic or racist political organizations belonging to the mainstream. And I think this ties in with what Fernando was saying. Spain is a very tolerant, multicultural society. The authorities enjoy the full support of the population when it comes to fighting jihadist terrorism. And our opinion polls, Elcano regularly conducts opinion polls, which are of course available on our website. They show that concern about terrorism, of course, declined during the economic crisis because Spaniards were more worried about unemployment and their economic difficulties. But as the Spanish economy has recovered, and let me remind you that we are now growing at more than 3% per annum, so we are the second fastest growing economy in Europe right now, concern about terrorism has actually increased, so that one concern has gradually displaced the other, as I believe is true in the United States.
Maybe I should add that the cooperation between Spain and Morocco on counterterrorism is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for one last question before, Emilio, I will ask you to the podium. Yes, please.
Alan Salma, former United States Ambassador to Spain. Oh, thank you. Charles, I was just going to make the same point. So I guess the question, and Spain has also been a model in the European Union in terms of integrating a Roma population. Mm-hmm. What does Spain have to teach the rest of Europe about some of the issues we talked about earlier in terms of successful absorption of new population? Mm-hmm.
Well, when people ask us why this is, we often answer, well, there are two things. First of all, that Spain itself has had a relatively recent experience of mass immigration. Hundreds of thousands of Spaniards left Spain in the 1960s to search for work in Europe. And on the whole, their experience was extremely positive. And I think sociologists and others generally believe that as a result of that, many Spaniards have had immigrants in their own families, and that therefore basically they like to treat other immigrants
Embrace that.
the way they were once treated themselves. Beyond that, Fernando is a political scientist and sociologist, he will correct me, but the other thing you have to take into account is how incredibly dramatically and very quickly Spain has changed over the last 50 years or so. What was once a very conservative, very religious society is today far more secular, and that this process of incorporating multiculturalism has been not only very rapid, but also surprisingly successful.
And still, perhaps the challenge for Spain concerning immigration coming from predominantly Muslim countries, and particularly Morocco, the challenge is with the second generations, because we now see how the problem of jihadist mobilization in Europe is strongly related to second generations. And Spain is not a country where the majority of the Muslim population is made out of second generations, contrary to France, Belgium, Finland, the UK, and so on. And therefore, what is going on there is a warning for us, also for the US, because the US is in a similar situation, that we have to do something, and there we have possibilities to counter the influence that the negative influence that might be affecting or might affect in the near future individuals suffering from identity crisis, identity tensions. And those individuals who no longer identify themselves with the country their parents came from, Morocco, for instance, they don't feel like members of the French society or the Spanish society, and some of them are truly vulnerable for reasons that we have to discuss here now, to the message that the nation they really belong to is the Nation of Islam. And who is promoting the Nation of Islam worldwide? The Arab League? The Organization of Islamic Cooperation? No. They say the Islamic State and even Al-Qaeda, still today. So our real challenge is with the social accommodation of, I prefer accommodation than integration, because we found in our research at Elcano Royal Institute that integration and radicalization are not incompatible. So you might have an individual who has a nice job, went to the university, their parents came from Morocco in the 90s, and he became a radical and jihadist. So we have a problem with this accommodation, and a lot of this problem to be solved has to do with the identity.
If I could just add,
Yes.
I don't know, Alan, whether this program was up and running when you were ambassador. And by the way, Alan Solomon was a brilliant US ambassador to Spain. May I say this in public? Spain has a very interesting experience in its within the prison institutions, and I understand there's a program between the US and Spain to try and share experiences on this front, because radicalization obviously very often takes place within the prison environment, and the Spanish police and the judiciary have been particularly sensitive to this, and I believe that this is something that both sides are working on quite effectively.
With that, I'd like to thank the panel for the discussion this morning, for the Wilson Center for holding it, for the opportunity to moderate it. Your Majesty, thank you for joining us for this exchange of ideas. And Emilio, I believe you have some closing remarks. Thank you.
Majesty, Mr. Margario, ambassadors. As you all know, if an accident is witnessed by 10 or you will end having at least 20 or more different narratives. So if I try to really summarize what has been said here, this is going to be extremely difficult. Let me try to, Twitter style, relate and explain some more the questions, open questions and the conclusions of this first transatlantic dialogue. And one of the few conclusions is that we will continue this dialogue next year in Spain. I want to underline that because that's probably one of the most relevant things we have succeeded obtaining in this meeting. No? Several important questions that have not been discussed because they are somehow taken for granted. First one is that we are in a completely new world, and that in this new world the United States in Europe are more interconnected than ever, and as a consequence of that, NATO and the transatlantic relations are extremely important. I think that this has not, it was part of my previous intervention, has not been challenged or discussed by anyone. It's somehow taken for granted, and I think that's important. No? Taken for granted also the idea that the European Union should become much more stronger. I mentioned Jean-Claude Juncker, we need more Europe in the Union and more Union in Europe. This is what we did not discuss because somehow was, as I said, taken for granted. What has been discussed? Of course, we started with the questions that are on the front page of the newspapers every day, which is the refugee crisis, the immigration crisis, the huge tide of humanity moving to Europe. Obviously, this is very much linked to the terrorist threat, and we have discussed at length also the terrorist threat in different dimensions, in the dimension in the Arab countries, in the dimension also especially in our countries, in the European countries. Finally, the core of both of these things is the unstable situation in the Middle East, the war in Syria, the war in Iraq, and of course we have also discussed this question. So probably these are the three main topics of our discussions. No? Some ideas advanced. First, certainly the bad governance of the Arab countries. I think we started with that, and I think this is an important idea. Many Arab countries are failed states. They will need institution building. If they don't have that, they push people outside. So there is kind of, a lack of stability in the Arab world, and that's certainly a cause not only for the refugee flow, but also for terrorism. It has frequently been mentioned by Fernando mainly, this idea of the second, third generation of Arab immigration in Europe, in Spain, as the main danger and providers of the recruiting process for the jihadist group. In the case of Spain, he offered us some very extremely relevant data. 50% of recently arrested by the police in Spain were all of them Spaniards. And therefore, we do not have yet second and third generation or huge numbers of second and third generation of Muslims in our countries. The relations between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Daesh has been discussed also. The danger coming from the territorialization of ISIS, the fact that controls territory, has armies, and the risks deriving from an eventual interconnection between those. They are now competing. It has been said they are competing, but they can easily move to a cooperation attitude, and that will create a major risk for the region. The lack of answer of the Arab countries has also, I think, is another important idea. The Arab countries are not responding, nor obviously to the terrorist threat, or to the contrary, but not either to the immigration and the refugee flow, which is certainly coming to Europe and is not finding shelter in the Arab countries. Finally, probably one of the most complicated questions was how to respond to the threat of the terrorism. It has been mentioned that the hard power was on steroids. In that context, the use of drones has been discussed with all the legal complications that the use of drones imply. On the contrary, we will need more soft power in terms of trying to control and avoid, especially, I listen now, the radicalization that takes place in our own countries, and not only in prisons, but in many social environment. A word that has appeared here and there was the word pessimism. If somebody say I have a pessimist view, then the next speaker says my view is more pessimistic than the first one. So certainly the result cannot be extremely optimistic. It is not, but at least we are aware of the problem and aware that we need to collaborate all of us. I am sure you're not here to listen to me or to some brainy academics. You came here to listen to the King of Spain, and now we turn to this part of the meeting. Thank you very much.
So hello again. Thank you to a great panel of pessimists. It's now time for optimism, and on behalf of the Wilson Center Board of Trustees and our distinguished former chairman, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, it is my honor to welcome His Majesty the King of Spain. As we discussed this morning, Spain has long been in the crosshairs of terror groups, radical Islamists, leftists, and separatists. Before 9/11 and in the years since, Spain has confronted a wide range of threats, enemies like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and ETA. I remember vividly, I think we all do, the Madrid train bombings in 2004, the worst terror attack in Spain's history and the worst in Europe since the Lockerbie bombing. I was then a member of Congress, and we all wondered if more mass casualty attacks were around the corner. The answer was yes. In London in 2007, in Paris twice this year, among others. No doubt Europe is in for more. We have lessons to learn. But Spain's response, as this panel said, has been impressive. Even as it confronts migration and economic pains, although now there's 3% growth, Spain has continued to keep its security commitments to its people, its neighbors, and its allies. You heard this morning from the panel on the challenges our countries share, but now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker's perspective on the issue. This is His Majesty's first official visit to the United States since taking the throne. Yesterday, he was at the White House, where he met with the President. His Majesty succeeded his father just over a year ago, and he spent that time connecting with his people. The reviews are in, and they're positive. Any U.S. presidential candidate would kill for his 81% approval rating. A helicopter pilot who earned his wings in both the Army and the Navy, he holds his master's degree from, guess where? Georgetown School of Foreign Service. At least one of the people in this room studied there with him, and he has many friends in Washington. He brings expertise and deep personal experience to security issues, and it's our privilege and honor to host him for this conversation. Please join me in welcoming His Majesty, the King of Spain.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Congresswoman Jane Harman, President of the Wilson Center, thank you for your very kind and gracious introduction. Would like to recognize the presence of our Foreign Minister and ambassadors, Secretaries of State, President of the Real Instituto Elcano, scholars and researchers and members of the panel. I very much regret that I haven't been able to listen to the whole panel discussion. I just came in towards the end of it in a very interesting moment about domestic politics, which I should not interfere with and will not comment upon. But I think that the topics chosen by this discussion were highly interesting and pressing in today's world and for our mutual interest. But allow me to thank all of you for your presence and participation, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot imagine how pleased I am to be here today in this transatlantic conversation on our common security challenges, jointly organized by the Wilson Center and our Elcano Royal Institute. And I would like to briefly also thank Honorable Jane Harman and her staff at the Wilson Center for making this event possible. Thank you so much. As you all know, she's a very distinguished career in the legislative branch and is the first woman to lead this venerable institution, something that both she and the Center should be very proud of. Let me also thank the chairman of the Elcano Royal Institute, Professor Emilio Lamo de Espinosa, for his enthusiastic support and leadership in this initiative. Professor Lamo de Espinosa is one of Spain's leading public intellectuals and a strong believer in the importance of the transatlantic relationship. As you may know, I hold an honorary presidency of Elcano since its foundation, and I'm happy to publicly thank him for his effective and inspiring leadership of an institution I really value personally very highly. I am pleased to see that both institutions are coming together at this event, and I hear that this is an ongoing initiative that will have a sequel in Madrid. We'll be very happy to host you there, and I will hopefully also be able to join you. As I understand it, a major goal of the Wilson Center, a living memorial to one of the greatest U.S. presidents of all time, is to honor him by providing a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of policy, so as to better serve in the public interest. I think it is fair to say that this reasoning is very similar to that which led us to establish in Spain the Elcano Royal Institute back in 2001, when I was still heir to the throne, mind you. Ultimately, both our institutions aim to understand the world better and to share that knowledge with decision makers, with our citizens at large, and to help make the world a better place. Given our common aims and interests, I very much hope that today's meeting will be the first of many, as well as contributing to our understanding of complex, challenging issues such as those you have been discussing this morning. It would also help us strengthen what is already a very rich and fruitful bilateral relationship between our two countries. And my visit here is touching upon many issues that affect our bilateral relations, and I'm happy to say that we're in very healthy shape. Relations between our officials, government officials, will be always essential. In this framework, we must acknowledge the positive contribution of prestigious think tanks, such as yours, Wilson Center, Elcano, regarding a better understanding of current challenges and finding ways to help decision makers solve and face and overcome these problems. We're here today, you all of you are here today to participate in what we have described as a transatlantic conversation, and I would like to make a few remarks about Spain's views, how we view the transatlantic relationship. Anyone who has ever looked at the map of the world or has read a bit about history will immediately understand why a transatlantic relationship is crucial, specifically to Spain. The main reason is that, in a very real sense, Spain is an American nation. As I argued in a talk I gave at Harvard University a couple of years ago, we are an American nation in the sense that for well-known historical and cultural reasons, we have a very strong, substantial American identity. And this we always have to remind even Spaniards about it, we cannot be understood. We cannot understand ourselves without that American dimension. I raise this because we all have a tendency to forget sometimes about Spain's centuries-long presence in a large part of North America, in the southwest of what is today the United States, eventually the entire territory west of the Mississippi. Similarly, in the entire Pacific coast from California to Alaska, including present-day Canadian territories, were explored by Spain's and were incorporated into dominions about 250 years ago. The first town founded in U.S. soil was St. Augustine by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, and precisely in this visit we'll be remembering intensely that event. I'll be traveling down to Florida and to St. Augustine and the days coming. In many ways, of course, this not only makes Spain an American nation, it also means that the U.S. is also deeply Hispanic. There are more than 50 million people, as Charles was reminding us, from Hispanic origin in this country. And remember, two Spaniards, Junípero Serra, who will be canonized next week by His Holiness Pope Francis here in Washington, and Bernardo Galvez, are part of your history as well as ours. and there are many others that help to strengthen ties between our two countries. Today's transatlantic relationship is about our common interest in many areas, but most specifically in trade and economic relations and security issues. Regarding security, let me remind you that in just the last few years, the U.S. and Spain have signed 2 new protocols amending our ongoing defense agreement from 1988. And under these 2 new protocols, 4 American Navy ships, missile defense ships, are currently deployed at Rota Naval Base, and a Marine task force is operating from the Moron Air Base. Above all, today's transatlantic relationship is about values, values which are deeply embedded in our respective national cultures. Most importantly, it is premised on our shared faith in freedom and democracy, equality of opportunity, and a rule-based international order. I think it is important to remember all this given the many challenges we currently face. Many of these, and allow me to name climate change, nuclear proliferation, global terrorism that you've so much touched upon today, are of a magnitude such that no single nation, however powerful, can tackle them on its own. More than ever, what is at stake leaves us no other way than to work together. Global threats need global solutions. The best way to guarantee our safety is to find a way to close tight alliances. Today, I would like to reiterate that from a Spanish and European perspective, the U.S. is our indispensable partner in dealing with all of these challenges. The Eurozone, one of the most developed and prosperous regions in the world, has, as you know, been affected deeply by economic difficulties. Spain is a part of it, has experienced a 6-year-long double-dip recession, which has taken a very heavy toll. Fortunately, the recession is over, and although we still face some daunting problems, including, most importantly, an unacceptably high unemployment rate, the worst is finally behind us. In fact, Spain currently enjoys one of the highest growth rates, as you've mentioned, in Europe. These problems, serious though they are, have not prevented Europe from being a responsible, active partner in the transatlantic relationship. When it comes to the key issues, whether it is struggle against climate change, fight against jihadist terrorism, the future of Afghanistan, or attempts to create a fairer, more inclusive system of global economic governance, the U.S. can rest assured in the knowledge that Europeans remain committed to what we continue to see as one of the cornerstones of the international system. Finally, I would like to mention a pressing issue for Europe, but also for other nations of the world, including the U.S. I am referring to the flow of refugees from countries at war. It is indeed a complex matter that must be addressed from many perspectives, but always keeping in mind and inspired by a greater sense of humanity and the protection of human rights, and the need to address the heart and origin of the problem. Today we have only had time to address some of these key issues, and again, I miss having had the opportunity to listen and maybe ask some questions to the experts. I very much hope that we will be able to meet again, perhaps in Madrid, as you've already seemed to have committed to do so, and continue to live up to the Wilsonian ideal of generating knowledge in the public interest. Thank you all for your presence, and I'm going to enjoy very much having the opportunity to continue some of these discussions in the luncheon that is going to be held later on. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to talk to you here today.
Okay. This is what 81% popularity looks like. I think in this room, you're over 100, though. Thank you, Your Majesty, and thank you to our distinguished panel. Thank you to your delegation for coming here, and thank you to Elcano Royal Institute for co-chairing and really adding so much brilliance to this panel. This concludes the public portion of our program. We hope the audience will remain seated while His Majesty departs, and some of you will be joining us at a luncheon to follow. Thank you again for coming.